Sorry, I don't know if you caught like the last bit of what I
No,
said, but
just the last part, if you could repeat it again. Yeah.
yeah, so basically I was just kind of trying to say that um, because these people like at the top, so political elites, they have a lot of power, so they are able to access a lot of state resources, but they're not really accountable to the people they're governing, so they tend to use these state resources as like personal resources.
Hmm. Hmm, hmm, hmm. One of the major categorizations or characteristic features of a neo-patrimonial state is that the distinguish or the perceived difference between what constitutes as public and private realm is not very clearly uh, observable. You would have public office bearers or those representative of the government considering state property as almost an extension of personal patrimony. The respect for private property rights would be extremely weak in such states. The bureaucracy or the relationship between the legislature or the one in command with the executive is predominantly weak, and that makes any execution of defined policies extremely difficult. The Nigerian case is interesting. I mean, of course, the book, as you know, is more dated, and Nigeria's context now may not necessarily in its entirety as just a patrimonial state. It has now characteristic features, as you would see, with maybe a fragmented multi-class state also in shades. But at a national level or as a low-income developing country, most states in parts of either South Asia or in parts of in different parts of Africa, you would find that there are states which would give you personified resemblances of such state formations. But I don't see observable features of such states only representative of developing countries. Are there examples that you can think of, illustratively speaking, where you would feel, and this is particularly true of the current sort of wave of the political movement and shift towards what we are defining as the right, where the sort of general respect for rule of law, institutional formations is weakening, and that's allowing a greater centralization of power in the hands or a narrow concentration of power in the hands of few leaders, and there is that effort to more or less patronize state structures. So can you think of also similar examples where that's happening in context, not just as the defining feature of state formation, but in the state conduct, you see elements of neo-patrimonial state? In context to, I mean, industrialized developed countries as well. I mean, it's not as if that all state formations in more or less say broader terms will be representative of only low income countries. These are intransient definitions, as I was saying, right? The last time that you will have states representing features of, let's say, neo-patrimonial cohesive capitalist at different stages of development, and you can find that across the board. But anything in particular to more industrialized societies as well, where this may be the case, or no, not possible? Yeah, Marta?
I'm not 100% sure if I understood the question, but I'm going to attempt to
Mm.
answer. The first thing that comes to my mind is rent seeking. I know it's very prominent in patrimonial states, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen in other states, especially if they're more powerful corporations with certain leveraging powers. They can also practice rent seeking in more industrialized countries. But yeah.
Yes. So, yeah, I mean, you have examples from rent seeking behavior in institutions within also what you'd consider as the part of the industrialized developed world. And the permutation or the penetration of rent-seeking behavior is going to be far more worse in new patrimonial state formations at large, but you have evidence of that even in societies where there are already structures in place which may be weakening over time. Peter, I know you had your hand up, so anything to add quickly? And
Yeah, just in terms of, I guess, mixing the public and the private, I guess you're saying there's been a lot of allegations that the Trump administration uses, state politics as a tool for self-enrichment.
Yeah. So, I mean, the classic case, which is what I was sort of pushing for, is that Trump's general conduct in presidential term has given a lot of representation of how patrimonial states have leaders who do consider state institutions as an extension of personal patrimony. And if you were to look at some of the features of neo-patrimonial states, some of those that strike more or less with what the reading argues is related to some of the points right here, which is the distinction between the public and private realms, and in context to just not just property rights, but the identification of what constitutes as defined, regulated by the state, and is an extension of personal or private space is not well established. I mean, and this has connotations for use, allocation, distribution of factors of production very closely. For those not, aware, factor endowments or factors of production would generally relate to land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, and something else which has also emerged in the last 30 to 40 years, but often in mainstream textbooks is not seen as a factor endowment of its own. What is that? That's the big T, which is technology. Usually, mainstream texts, particularly in economics, tend to talk about land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, but technology is seen as invested capital. It's branched out of that category now, more or less. So you have each of these, the use and allocation or distribution of each of these factors. The product of that is for the private space, where individuals do have access to land, can employ workers if they have a business, can invest capital in the financial market, but also in other forms. So that any sort of a non-neo-patrimonial state would have in the patrimonial construct, the private space may not be that well established. States emerge with weak centralized forms. So there is a tendency to centralize power in patrimonial states. There is a tendency for personalistic form of leadership, which may or may not appear to be populist in nature, but they have barely legitimate authority structures in place where the executive is in many ways not able to implement what the centralizing power is trying to do. They may or may not be constrained by norms or institutional forms, and that is something which you would find with most low income or middle income countries. Nigeria is mentioned as a reference point here, but if you remember in the last session, I had left you with asking you to think about one more example of each of these categories. Can you think of something else as well beyond what the author is arguing or presenting? Any other examples of with the same features or similar features of neo-patrimonial states that you can think of? Mm-hmm. 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 Des, you want to go ahead, take a drink?
Sorry, me?
No,
Hello.
Des and then Peter. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. I'm thinking of the Philippines during the dictatorship of former President Marcos. because during that time he or his family used like the central bank of the country to for his own needs or for his own control without thinking much of
That's a good example. Philippines
yeah.
under it would be a good example.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one. Ikram, do you want to take a guess? Anything you can think of? I'll slowly ask guys for you to reflect on what could be those cases, because this is very central to the way we look at states post uh, the cases we would be studying. Anything that comes to mind? Anyone else? Mm-hmm. Mm. Luis, anything? Or Jonathan, anything comes to mind?
Um, I think of mostly Congo or even Cameroon with Paul Biya, where we see there's a blur between their personal wealth and the wealth of the nation. Yeah.
That's a good example. All right. Okay. And so one of the other cases you would find also of patrimonial states is that of, so it's interesting. I mean, a lot of people, and this has been part of a evolving conversation, tend to see the design of patrimonial state linked very closely to authoritarianism or dictatorship. You would find in some cases where principally countries may be defined as democracies, where there are elections, but still demonstrating certain features which are linked to a patrimonial state. And that has that in some cases that there is a limited bearing, and this is a big question in political science about correlative mapping of whether neo-patrimonial states generally need to be or seen as authoritarian in nature or not. So the suggestion and the research sort of examination of that is wide open. It's a debate yet to be well settled, but always open to further investigation. Peter, I'll give you the last word on this before I move on to the next.
My example, I mean, I guess on the topic of a neo-patrimonial state with some nominal elements of democracy, my example would be Lebanon, where there's technically like electoral democracy, but there's very extensive embezzlement of public funds by politicians, very little trust in the government.
Yes, so you'll have a lot of examples within Asia, West Asia, and others where you would see there are certain states which would meet those categorizations. The next one is this is an interesting categorization. I feel that the word or the use of the word cohesive capitalist is drawn by the author in context to situating them opposite ineffectiveness, just basically being able to get things done from a new patrimonial state construct, and to be defined as a cohesive capitalist state. Now, these states are characterized by a cohesive, centralizing, or in many cases, the use of the word consensus driven might be problematic, because a lot of time the agency of the people may not, or the voice of the people may not be in representative terms defined, but the state definitely seems to claim that, which is that this is sort of a cohesive narrative that we need to present. And these states have pretty well established bureaucratic structures. They're centralized in nature. The nature of purposive authority often penetrate deep into the society. So the state society compact, so as to speak, is extremely well grounded. And that foundation allows for these states to in many cases embark on a higher path of economic growth. The equation of putting economic growth to let's say national security has been seen or can be seen as some of the key areas for these states to focus on. And one of the examples or one of the ways to looking at this is to see that centralizing states or leaders with centralizing power would often equate national security with issues of rapid economic growth. There is often, but not necessary, a close social alliance between state-producer relationships. I mean, the relationship between state and capital or state and business would, in case of cohesive capitalist states, need to be strongly tied. That is where the cohesion or principles of cohesion in power control would build. These states do not necessarily anticipate greater churn or opposition in demonstrating those who are already in power to lose power. So a lot of the single party states which have effectively managed high growth and effective governance would or can be positioned in this category. They don't stand, I mean, they're not in power for a shorter duration of time, which is how getting things implemented and done over long-term policies is possible. There is an interesting corollary of these states, which is exercising a tighter control over labor. Now, you do see this happening now globally. The nature of discussions around immigration politics, right, at large, not just in Europe or North America. I think it's broadly a common point of deliberation for many countries now, where and how there is a tighter control on workforce, mobility of workforce. So it's very interesting. I mean, if you look at the late 20th century, one of the major features of the late 20th century uh, uh, was that there was a greater emphasis amongst countries on financialization of capital, right? Like the idea of countries making it more easy for capital to move across from each other across countries was encouraged, and policies that would categorize that were adopted. I mean, you could club these under extension of applied suggestions under the Washington Consensus kind of policies, which the US sort of advocated with the consensus of many other countries. But mostly the rise of what we define as the neoliberal world order or supply side economics was on financialization of capital. Now, you don't find the same enthusiasm when it comes to the movement of labor, a movement of workforce. There are very few countries, in fact, the US being one of the few, and I mean, Canada in context of the 70s and the 80s, which tentatively follow a loosened immigration structure, where there is an encouragement of people entering with diversified skill sets, and the workforce mobility was encouraged. You see that as a major bone of contention between the UK and Europe for much of their relationship, which was tied on this big major issue of Europe sort of having mobility of movement safeguarded, but the UK not being sort of all the more fine with having preferential or equal weightage of treatment to Europeans as against British citizens. This has been a big concern, but where you find cohesive capitalist states to be seen to be more quote unquote effective is that they do exercise in a domestic sense greater control over labor. Now, some of this may happen through ideological mobilization, some of this may happen through other social cultural factors, but you do see the evidence of that clearly there. Competent bureaucracy, unlike patrimonial states, you'll find cohesive capitalist states to be more competent in terms of getting things done, the executive to be working well with the legislative. In some cases, the judiciary also works in a very executivized environment, so it's not independent completely of the legislature or the executive, but in complementary terms is trying to achieve common goals. And this gives you a sort of a formulaic representation of authoritarian leadership. Most cohesive capitalist states would demonstrate some element of authoritarian leadership, which is more assertive by using instruments of ideological mobilization in getting this done. Now, you have examples from certain authoritarian rule with countries within South Korea. You can see in Park Chung-hee, 1960s is the period of time really where there's almost a militarization of economic growth with national security factors. The word disciplining of citizens is often used, where disciplining is equated with policing norms. You have Brazil's example in under Estado Novo. There are other cases as well that you can think of. And this is an important category because a lot of advocates for countries which are less effective in getting things done tend to give examples of East Asia, other countries where cohesive structures tend to make things more effective. But it would be interesting to explore where and how you can look at other and more examples to explain this. Yes, Ikram? Yeah.
Just a question, is China considered a cohesive capitalist state or?
Yes. So that's the question I was about to just ask to all of you. But now that you have asked, where would you position China in this? Because I had a very interesting observation shared by a student earlier, actually. One of the times I taught this course, and that stayed with me somewhere because everything that you see here would give you an example of a reference point that China fits this category. So where would you put China in this? Would you see China as a cohesive capitalist state?
From my understanding of this type of state, I do see China, although you see more authoritarianism in Chinese state model, but I do see how China is focused on has a very cohesive industrial policy, and the government is promotes industrialization, and they are very result oriented. So from this point of view, I do see China as kind of a cohesive capitalist state.
Okay, others? Anyone else who wants to reflect and share your thought? Not just on China, I mean, it could be on anything else as well, but on the category itself, anything that comes to mind? Yeah.
I think it just depends if you're looking at China with eyes from the history of China, like in the past, or if you're looking at modern China. Because in my opinion, if you're looking at China, not in the last 20 years or 30 years, but before that, then it definitely fits that box of cohesive capitalist state.
Oh, you mean before last 20, 30 years, as in prior to that, it gives you example or a reference of a cohesive.
Yeah, because if you look at the history of how they were in very dire situations under, depending on the, the emperor at the time or the leadership and the policies that they were really hard on their people, especially because in very dire positions until they started to, realize that their potential was on the numbers of their people and started opening up their markets to, other countries and trading and so on and so on. But before that, it was very dire. And at the beginnings of that, if I recall well, the mandate was that, everybody had to join the workforce. Everybody had to, you know what I mean, and be part, especially with in the steel industry, and there was no choice for citizens. It was quite the regime, if I can call it like that. So it just depends on with what eyes are we looking at China and which time frame, because they have evolved from the come a long way, have evolved. But at the very beginning, when they started this engine of economic development, they were very much authoritarian. They were very much, control over labor, ideological organization. So they fit that box very, and I might be wrong, but I based on my general knowledge, I believe they pretty much fit in that shoe, depending on that time, and of course with international law and being able to be part of joining trading with other economies and so on, more policy came through in terms of human rights, in terms of labor laws, in terms of know that they care much in a way, but they have changed over time to become more flexible with that in order to be able to trade with these countries, because there is an ethical principle that when it comes to labor and people that they should follow. And there's a lot of controversy around that still, but they have come a long way. So I think it just depends with the time, which time frame are we talking about, and just evaluating that progress that China has made over time.
Okay. No, a lot of, I mean, I would sort of build upon our conversation from that. I mean, those are very useful observations. So one interesting thing, Marta, before you say anything, which is interesting to look at these categorizations, and I've been emphasizing this from earlier, is by calling them intransient conceptualizations, you have to identify which time and space is what you're looking at a country in, to be able to map which category fits better in representation of what characteristic features it is showing. You will have features of a country demonstrating itself for a couple of decades or a decade as one which is more cohesive in nature, and then sort of slips down the slope and gives you more or less a reflection of a multi-class fragmented state or a patrimonial state. So of course, time is a very critical factor. It's also very interesting to look at the nature of political economy in context to how the state is doing, and which is why with many low-income and middle-income countries, as they're growing, and what we define and we've put in the category in our course as post-colonial nation states, as late developing or late industrializing states, the changes are happening in some cases very quickly, in some cases across decades, which in cases of early industrializers, quote unquote, or colonizers, happened across a century. I mean, you would have Britain, for example, demonstrating change, industrial change, absorbing itself to basic socioeconomic change across 50 to 60 years. In China, for example, you see China, and we do this later in the course about doing some comparison between India and China on performance of indicators, not on the nature of polity, but on performance of certain development indicators. And you'll see that early 1980s, both countries are demonstrating very similar features in terms of having maximum population in the agricultural sector, predominantly having a large number of poor people who are finding it difficult to get basic needs. And in a decade or 2-decade period, I mean, China completely sort of eradicating what would be seen as abject, absolute poverty. There are issues of course, relative inequality and distribution of growth. Those stay in for most countries, but doing a sort of a remarkable job in eliminating some of the structural barriers which were affecting its large economy in a very short period of time, which other countries did in very long. And it gives you a clear reference point in categorizing it as one which is at least a cohesive state. Centralized purposive authority of the leadership trying through a single party system to ensure that there are certain reforms that take place. Those reforms have domestic growth, as it becomes more and more self-sufficient in its sort of larger economic landscape. It enters the world economy by the early 90s and then starts sort of almost dictating terms with a very higher export-led industrializing model, and becomes, in a certain sense, the factory of the world. But a lot of things went behind that to be able to make China where it came, and I think that's why the course looks at talking about post-reform economies in context to China as well. But there is a caveat here, and I want to sort of keep that small the small space in the door open with when it comes to China. You can't, all features mentioned here do not exactly as much as it appears to resemble with one phase or period of China. There are certain exceptions to the rule, and I want to sort of ask you guys to think what those exceptions might be if you're on the China topic. So first Marta and then Ellison. Marta, go ahead.
Oh, I think my question was already answered. It was sorry, the question that I wanted to answer was already answered. It was what if China fits into this category. I was gonna agree and say, but the main difference would be the ideological foundation, in my
Yes,
opinion.
absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
China, yeah, so China, the party specifically, the goal remains socialist modernization. So even though they use capitalist tools to achieve economic goals, at the end of the day, their core ideology remains socialism, and that's how they differ from the rest.
Absolutely. I'll come back to that. Ellison, please go ahead.
It was not to respond to the question, but more question that I had regarding that. Could we say in this case that like all the Asian tigers, like Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and stuff, fit into this cohesive capitalist state, like more around like the 1960s to the 1919 or the 2000s, if I believe so?
Yeah, so you can definitely put Taiwan, Singapore, in that space. You can also put South Korea in the 70s, late 60s, in a very similar light. Not all East Asian economies, of course, but those three would give you features. Hong Kong is slightly more because of the extension of its colonial institutional architecture, which you see in the last sort of decade quite rapidly eroded through the extension of mainland China's or the Communist Party's sort of taking charge of Hong Kong. That scenario changes very rapidly. But before that, you see more features of less of a cohesive capitalist, but more in context to one which is an effective state. But Taiwan definitely, and South Korea definitely. Singapore gives you a very good example again as well. Single party and allowing for pro-market principles of pushing towards reform, growth, while having tight control over labor, very strong laws, more or less very competent bureaucracy and authoritarian leadership. I mean, like from Lee Kuan Yew, the Lee Kuan Yew years were very instrumental with Singapore's rule. Now, yeah, coming back to China, and I think that is very interesting what Francia and Marta said. The ideological disposition of the Chinese have been not at all in any way projecting capitalist means and forms. In fact, it's a country which still you will find, and as you read more on it, it still doesn't have much regard for private property rights. It's one of the biggest, I would say, outliers of a country which has done so well without having a large space for private property rights to be respected for. The state does have an overarching and overreaching power on the private space. At the same time, the 1980s and 90s, you would see in China are features of pro-business and then pro-market reforms across sectors, but not all sectors are opened up for in that regard. And that's a very clear choice that the party makes in order to not compromise on its political position, or in any way reforms that are not interest capital, or which are not interest compatible with the party's overall vision and sort of ideological disposition, do not find much great ground. And I think that's very important to understand and acknowledge with the Chinese story. It does give you everything here in terms of features of being seen as a cohesive state, but less of a capitalist, but more of a socialist or communist state. Ideologically speaking, the tools of ideological mobilization are less capitalist in nature. And that's a big, I think it's a big waning or wedging point between the state and its people now. The current generation of the Chinese um, uh, people, particularly the youth, do not understand the pre-90 form and structure of the State Society Compact. And the State Society Compact is created around that period. Much of that compact is based on ensuring employment. The Chinese state ensures that you have good employment opportunities, higher incomes, and you can get access to whatever you may need. But it would come at the compromise of extensive civic and other kinds of freedoms, which may or may not be valued by people of that period of time. But much of now the scenario is that the young people look for a greater agency of expression in matters of what influences their lives. And this is a big question for the Chinese state. I mean, a lot of China-based scholars, I would say, when I say non-China-based scholars, as in those not living or based in China, who've been writing about China, have been arguing is that, oh, the model is extremely shaky, things may go out at any point of time, but it's a very resilient country. The state has managed to hold itself together for many years. But to Francia's point, I think on the period of time, I think this is very important. The distinction between post Deng Xiaoping China and the pre-Deng Xiaoping China is very striking. In fact, it's the last 35 years which gives you the evidence of it becoming more cohesive in nature. China under Mao or the pre-Deng Xiaoping years is very different. In fact, not fitting in many cases here of being purposive in nature, having a competent bureaucracy, even though there is authoritarian leadership within the party. Growth is not happening at the pace that may be expected, even though there's a lot of focus on national security. But 1978 changes that, and you see that in evidence of where 1980s is. I mean, China does very well. We'll put a lot of data for you to make sense. 80s, China starts doing extremely well in domestic industrial policy reform. There's a huge focus on industrial production, rapid structural transformation of workforce from agriculture to manufacturing. And by the time you see the 90s, which is where China sort of opens itself up to the world, becomes a member of the WTO, and is part of all international trade and financial agreements, it's in a completely different space. And those reforms of the 1978 years are very critical. So we'll come back to that, but this will be the sort of broader features of what a cohesive capitalist state would look like. The more recent cases, I think, if you're looking at for one main example, I would say from the East Asian context would be Singapore, and to a certain extent, South Korea under Park Chung-hee and others since then. Okay, let me move to the third category then, and take our case for talking about the fragmented multi-class state. Now, anything on this one, particularly that you came across or read, which you could reflect on? Anyone? Where would you position fragmented multi-class states in context to? Yes, Charlie, please.
So what I thought was really interesting with this idea about the fact that just inherently because the fragmented multi-class states are required to approach a wide range of topics, they can ultimately be less effective because their attention is split in multiple approaches, and they're also more they have to respond to the needs of their own people and their own sort of they're often responsible to going back to their electorates in a way that is sometimes occurs less in the other categories. So I just find that to be really interesting in terms of because I imagine a lot of so-called developed states would fall in fragmented multi-class states, but then they're also not necessarily achieving a rate of policy development at the same extent as countries that are under authoritarian governments. So I thought that was an interesting separation between the classes.
Absolutely. And one of the interesting things with fragmented multi-class state is that the relationship between the state and the society, or even its business class, is not well cemented. There is a certain amount of tension or friction in the state finding a more temporal basis of alliance. And there are different groups now in very one way to understand fragmented multi-class state is by going back what allows for cohesion in cohesive states. And what is one of the, if I had to ask you a question on what is a necessitating condition for cohesion to take place in the state-society compact, what would that be? What would be that necessitating or sort of a prerequisite of cohesion to take place in state-society compact for a cohesive capitalist or socialist state?
I guess it would be where the power lies. It would be sort of power structures.
Yeah, but what would allow for greater power between the state-society relationship? So, one of the key reasons for the society to feel itself being represented and heard and listened to in the state that is sort of anchoring it and is sort of in its physical sense is representing it in the government or the party, will have that condition being met. And it has to do a little bit, the hint I have to give you here is, and this is open to anyone, which is, it has to do with culture. It has to do with, the answer to this is less sort of political or economic, but more social. So I've given you a small hint. What would be a necessitating condition for that cohesion to actually take place? Because if that condition is not there, you'll find fragmented multi-class states to always struggle in having a strong state-society compact. Yes?
Is it like racial, regional, and economic divides between the wealthy and the poor? Like, for example, in Brazil, like the wealthy south versus the poor north kind of thing, and like policy volatility, or even violence, populist appeals to different identity based.
Francie, your voice is not very audible. I'm really sorry. This time when you started speaking, can you repeat?
Sorry, one second.
Yeah, this is better. I can hear you now.
Can you hear me now better?
Yes, much better.
Oh, sorry. My connection with Zoom has been really bad.
Yeah, I know this is fine. It's just the audio.
Yeah, sorry, just one second. I'm having technical difficulties. Well, I was thinking like racial, regional, and economic divides between the wealthy, like in a country, for example, there's always the South and the North, or like there is regions, right? And those regions differ a lot based on their economic status or situations. Like for example, in Colombia, right? Like social classes, we see a lot of that, and we see a lot of divide because of that. So, or for instance, in Brazil, like, racial, regional, and economic divides between the wealthy South and the poorer North kind of thing. And so this adds to political volatility, violence, disappointment, or not support from the public, populism amongst, yeah, that's what I'm going for.
Yeah, Marta, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, after hearing her answer, I'm not really sure I understood the question. I thought the question was, what kind of is also needed to make cohesive capitalist states work?
Social condition.
Social conditions. So my take on it would be the is it called the Asian core values or the Confucian values? I know it's more tied to China, but it's that sort of mentality of respect and meritocracy that's kind of normalized within society that allows for the cohesive capitalist state to function more easily, let's say, like than in North America, where there's that certain respect for authority and normative behavior in society. But I'm not sure
Yeah,
if
I mean, you both are, I mean, I think spot on. The short answer is you need a certain ethno-linguistic homogeneity in your social structure, with the people representing or being part of a larger identity, which the state itself, in a majoritarian sense, identifies. It's a very difficult task for a more diverse, fragmented, ethnically, racially, from perspectives of both class and caste. If there's a huge difference in identity formation, which is socially identifiable amongst people, the state-society compact would always be struck on a temporal, class, caste, or social identity-based alliance. And in fragmented multi-class states, they tend to be situated in between patrimonial and cohesive capitalist status, because public authority often tends to be fragmented. It's more temporal. That alliance is more temporal because it's based on sort of mutual trust. In cohesive states, however, you will have, and I mean, in China's case also, the Han community is its majority. The point, Mata, you made about Confucius values, one of the reasons that Confucius values would find greater meaning and resonance is because the Han community tends to acknowledge Confucian as an important source of philosophical inspiration in terms of practice of civic values. I mean, interestingly, a Chinese scholar once told me that Confucian is more popularized by the state than the people, but there is a sense of that identity mapping because more and more people relate and identify with that. But there are minorities, and ethnic minorities, the Uyghur Muslim community in China, which has found extremely difficult circumstances to exist and work closely with the state. The state, in fact, in its own design, has been extremely exclusionary to the minority. You don't see an impact at the mainstream level because the numbers are extremely small, and much of that voice is less heard in the representation of state authority. But you can't say that for fragmented multi-class states. You will have pressure points, vested interests. Also, at the same time, the alliance of a particular ethnicity represented as a state through a party or through an individual only striking an alliance for a period of time, while others sort of weigh in to what that candidate or what that party brings for them. But they can easily vote that person out or bring that or take that person out of power. And that friction and that conflict is always there, which is why the fragmented multi-class states may always remain more politicized. Their strength of institutional capabilities or capacities may often try to make reform very interest compatible to the state society relationship. Staying in power is very difficult. And it may have delays in decision making. In some cases, leaders, in fact, have issues of legitimacy and they may overpromise when they come into power. So you do find this scenario, in fact, in much of the democratic um, governance structure. But you will also find this, that where there is authoritarian structures in place, there are also fragmented multi-class state identities, but the ability of an authoritarian leader to hold on to power for a very long period of time will depend on a number of factors and how well he or she relates to an ethnic diversity criteria. But in cohesive states, there is a larger homogeneity in social identity of that community. And I think that's a very important necessitating condition for other factors to hold true, whether it's on labor or executive bureaucracy being more effective, all of those things find greater meaning. Yes, Francia, please go ahead.
Yeah, just food for thought. I just have an interesting question. So what happens, which can be tied to what's happening right now in the world, with Iran and Israel and the US and all that. And so what happens when other states interfere into fragmented multi-class states? Like, right? Like, to me that's just fascinating, and that's a whole, I know it's like a whole different topic, but since we're discussing it, I always like to tie things back to the current
Yeah, yeah.
conditions, since we're discussing these things. And so because we see that so often with the United States, and particularly the G7 countries going in and interfering, and there's a whole history of that between the West and the East, about the United States going into other countries, taking down leaderships, interfering constantly on that. And so it's interesting to me, is like, what are the lines, like the divide, what I'm sorry, it's just, yeah, you probably know where I'm
Yeah,
going, where I'm going with
that's
this, but
a
yeah.
good question, and a timely one. And I also acknowledge and credit you for asking it, because many people may want to sort of just avoid tiptoe into what's really happening. I think, see, one of the interesting things, and I'll just very quickly share also. I mean, just take this not in core value with what we are discussing in the class right now, and on just the formulation of conceptual notes. But this is a column that I just written for a national daily back in India, which was on the Iran-Israel conflict. And I would probably say that some part of your question is answered in here, but just to lay out in context to what's really happening. I mean, that's been one of the key issues, right? If there is a very strong domestic state society compact, and you see exogenous forces or external forces playing or intruding into that space, you will find in societies which have greater ethnic solidarity and a greater sort of presence of ethnic identity with what the state represents. They may not agree with everything that the government does, right? Or they may not agree with everything what the leadership may say, and they may have their own issues. But it's very interesting that with any external force which doesn't sort of relate with the sort of social identity based markers that will be resisted. And I think this is, I mean, the case of Iran, for example, is very, very clear. It is a country which doesn't respond very well to exogenous forces. I mean, as an external
Yeah.
forces trying to cause change, and it, independent of what issues it may have, people may have with its own leadership. And I sort of expand on this, that it is sort of counterproductive to expect things changing over time. And it's not, I mean, if you can expand that purview to larger context, not just Iran, but in any society. I mean, I can give you another example, which in fact we look at, and this is a country which is assigned as a case to, I think, some group as a presentation exercise. That's Botswana. And Botswana's case was very interesting because it's a small country, landlocked, closer to South Africa. You have the British controlling almost much of southern parts of different African countries back by the 1920s and 30s, and extremely powerful. And you have a few Swana tribal communities very well represented and also very well sort of working with the local tribal groups, and the people sort of trusting those chieftains, resisting the British colonial force, and engaging in what was a protectorate dominion status agreement, where the British sort of agreed that they're going to only use a certain part of the space for traveling into other parts of the region, but not in any way interfering with the governance structures there. There is one effort made, I think, around the 1930s, where the British administration, the colonial forces, try to sort of throw out the local chieftains to gain more power, but it's heavily resisted. So wherever there is a strong domestic, either ethnic, racial, or social identity-based compact between the state and society, you'll find that exogenous and external forces will find it extremely difficult to cause any form of internalized change. And I think that's been true of history. It's been true of many regions. It's true of states. I mean, I can give you an example from my home country. You have states where for example, the current leadership of a very assertive form of authoritarian leadership has not been able to make roots. It's Bengal, states like Bengal, or provincial places like Bengal, and the south of India, Tamil Nadu. The governments are the communities are very strongly in ties with the government. I mean, they see their identity being represented by one of their own, and they're happy sort of changing the person they don't like, but they don't like being dictated from the outside about what language to speak, what food to eat. Those kind of things do not really stand. And that's the diversity of India. The north and south and east and west are completely in different contours. Languages are different, cultures are different. And the current national party has found itself to be it's not able to find ways to penetrate into those states, even in state elections. And so I think this is a key point, the point that you have raised. Fragmented multi-class states would have a greater problem in being able to retain power, precisely for this reason, because there's constant mobilized opposition from different contours, and there are always vested interest groups, which will make things of legitimacy and credibility more difficult. So maybe to a certain extent that responds to what you were saying, but we can talk more about that separately. So I'm going to sort of take a pause at this point, because we've discussed a number of things here across these categories, but let me sort of quickly reflect on asking any questions that you might have based on what we have discussed on each of these conceptual categories we have looked at today. Any questions?
I just have one last question that you don't have
Yeah,
to expand on a lot, but just and it ties into in terms of how states evolve and change based on different, external or internal, actions. So when my question will be like, if a state is fragmented, right, multi-class, and an exogenous force comes in and interfere, then what about what remains? Like, does that initial structure, the fragmented multi-class or cohesive or whatever, changes, or does it go back to being eventually with time to be in a multi-class, fragmented state or cohesive states? Like, is that the historical trend?
Yeah, so the short answer to that is, as the history of colonial forms of extractive exogenous or external pushes to cause internal change will show you in evidence that if there is a higher degree of fragmented, diverse, ethnically fragmented social order, which is not represented by a more assertive state and necessarily does not have a strong military or army, you would find change to happen. And in that case, you would find the exogenous actor or the external actor to be in more or less successful terms to maybe overthrow a particular government or cause certain institutional changes. Now, whether to what extent that is accepted by the people at large is a questioning point. I mean, the biggest example I can think of is the case of the British Empire in the Indian context. I mean, when the British
Yeah.
sort of came in through the East India Company, they were able to control major ports, right? Which is for trading routes, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. Those three major ports were what the company had, but they had absolutely no idea how to manage, even look at the inland areas. And it took them around 50 to 60 years, in fact, to figure that out. It's only around 1850, from 1790 to 1850, when the change in the sort of rule of colonial government takes place from the company, East India Company, to the Queen's government. That is where the Westminster sort of structure really comes and starts playing a role in the way governance happens in the colonial administration. But the British found in many areas, regionally speaking, extremely difficult ever to cause serious changes. The two areas where I feel they did reasonably well, and there is a reading, in fact, in which you would find very interesting if you're, which is one topic on indigo and law in colonial India, where property law in India came as a result of the nature of indigenous dispute amongst communities. And the local dispute settlement mechanisms were failing to settle those disputes. And then you had an exogenous sort of force which allowed for a rules-based system to be created, and that was accepted by all. And it's explained exceptionally well by Tirthankar Roy. But that the case there was of indigo conflict, but the divide was between peasants and landlords, and then you had an external force sort of settling. And so it depends. I mean, the answer is, but historically, you will find that wherever there is the absence of an assertive state to be able to control and manage people and represent their needs, you will give space for exogenous agents to call change. Again, West Asia has been in a sense wrongly labeled in that regard, where that it is unstable and local polity is like that. But no, there is, in very limited scenarios, you will find when there is weak governance that external forces have been successful in maybe causing regime change or
Yeah, I think
changing the government.
like-
But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I think the biggest example, well, not the biggest, but I think if I'm not wrong, a good example of a more modern situation like that will be Afghanistan and what happened with Afghanistan in the US. You saw after the US left, because they really had this agenda of making Afghanistan more democratic. And I think they failed at that, and they caused havoc and destroyed that country, and or participated in some things improved, but some things remained and went back. You have the Taliban taking over and other groups and regional groups and so on, which pretty much to put back what was there before, the laws, and so yeah, it's a great example, because even though the United States interfered so much and did so much in that country, if you look at it today, it's all sort of going back to sort of the same state as it was before.
Absolutely,
pretty much,
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. And that's been a big question, Afghanistan. I mean, till the time a lot of the internalized forces adopt and practice socio-cultural change. I mean, let's say on areas of gender rights and education
Yeah,
reform
absolutely.
for girls. And I mean, that's been a big issue. I mean, most of people I know who've worked in that regard in civil society have been quite vocal about how the sort of, I mean, in a certain sense, a paternalistic outlook towards socioeconomic development has often been an issue. But historically, I mean, it's interesting, but historically, that was really not the case even in Afghanistan till the 1960s and early 70s, there was a sort of a huge adoption of urbanization and modern urban practices, which sort of lost its way. But you're right. I mean, external forces, even if we would want to make or cause or bring progressive, liberal sort of change in systems where they may not necessarily be immediately adopted. But what I would probably say is it starts at least a conversation amongst certain corners within the internal fabric to resist as much as is possible the change that is there. I mean, one also another good example was UAE, which with respect to doing reasonably well on the economic spectrum, but having extremely regressive sociocultural laws with respect to crime and punishment and many other regards, and then to allow for international law related rules to have a say in regulating that. It took a lot of time, but eventually a few of those changes were brought in. So yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting perspective to also understand how and the degree of compact that you have between the local people and, I mean, the representative of those people in the state, and how well that connect is established. But Botswana's case is interesting, as I said. In this case, in certain cases, as you pointed out, Afghanistan, West Asia, all of these give you a very good sort of a reference point. Indonesia is another country. I mean, I think one group is looking at Indonesia, and you'll find some amazing examples from Indonesia about how it has had a sort of an innate healing capacity to address the sort of wrongs of the past by causing internal change, which the state then over a period of time and through its endogenous or internalized forces correct for, while accepting a greater fragmented identity of the polity. I mean, it has people from very different, diverse sociocultural mappings. Not all are from practicing Islam practices, and they have a very extremely moderate view on many other cross-religious practices to also find ways, and that's allowed for Indonesia to do reasonably very well in the region as well as an economy. So we'll come back to those cases as we further talk. So I have something as a small task, guys, for you to look at, but just let me, in the interest of time, ask you to proceed through that. If there are no more questions, any more questions based on what we've done today so far? Well, if something comes to your mind, please make a note and we'll can address those towards the end. Okay, I'm just putting you a particular text because I'm very keen that you'll take a look at some part of this. This is going to sort of deviate away from our discussion in the earlier part of the class, but it brings into perspective the different approaches to international political economy that are taken by two dominant disciplinary influences. And I'll use the word disciplinary influences quite cautiously here, because in the nature of world power and geopolitics, these two transatlantic, I think, influences are not the only ones which have a bearing on international political economy or the world order. There are many other spaces that do have the dominant role. But in terms of the discipline of international political economy, the American, the British schools of thought have a great bearing. And I wanted, just for the class, because a lot of you are coming from different backgrounds, to just take a look at this particular text by Cohen. And there are a few questions that you may keep in mind as you read through, which can help you make notes accordingly. I'll give you roughly 40 minutes of time. You can take the first 5 minutes to take a short break and then start reading through the text, and take your notes accordingly as you read through. The text is there already in the readings folder on the drive that was shared earlier, so you would have that. And I'd just like to see a raise of hands to know if everybody has the text in front of them. And these would be the questions that you might as well want to look at as you respond to some of the questions, some of the aspects of what is mentioned in the text. So that will help you over time make your notes accordingly. But just first, I think, look at the text and then be able to observe and make your notes accordingly. Okay, so I think most of you. Okay, Katie, Laura, Shiana, others. Do you have a copy of the text, please, guys? Just if you can raise your hand. Everyone else, I do still see a lot of people whose hands are not up. It's also a good way to know who's attentive and who's not. Okay, right. All right, so you could start reading, guys. Take the first 5 minutes, maybe take a short break, and then just go into the text, read through it. Keep these questions in mind and make your notes based on what you read, and we'll start discussing this thereafter. Thank you. You could turn off your hands, maybe virtual hands.
I put the file in the chat if anybody has a hard time finding it. So
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Professor, sorry, could you keep the questions on the
Yeah,
screen? I
just
just
give
can't.
me 1 minute. I need to respond quickly to an email and then let me do it.
Sure, thank
I, yeah, just give me 1 minute. Yeah. I can see this now. Okay. Next 5 minutes, let's start, please. Okay, guys, we'll get started. That's fine. Whatever you would have read by now, could just maybe take the conversation forward, please. Okay. Okay, let's look at question number 1. All right, let me first ask quick feedback, reflections on the text. Of course, very different from what you would have read earlier, but any thoughts when you were going through this? Anything interesting? Mhm. Yes, Mary Pat?
Well, I didn't get through the whole text, but I liked how it read pretty smoothly, like based on these questions that you had set out, it kind of addressed each one of them in the text itself. So it had a natural kind of built-in comparing and contrasting, which made it quite clear about which ones might be applied where and like the way they're structured. So I appreciated that within the text. It made it new for it being new content for me, especially. I appreciated that.
Okay, all right. Anyone else? Yeah.
I can go for it.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
try to go for so based on the reading, it's kind of like they're fairly different and one sort of critical of the other. So like the American is very hegemonic. And then you can say that the British is more anti-orthodox, like frequently critical of the US intellectual hegemony. So if I was to take it to a, let's say, like how they analyze inequality in a sense. So, for example, the American utilizes global trade and financial systems. An example is like the Global Trade Organization or international markets to achieve success or face challenges. So they might examine like how a country's economic approach or capacity to create and enforce policies enables it to harness globalization for growth or poverty reduction. But it sort of overlooks like the long, like how do I explain this? It sort of overlooks factors like colonial history or global capitalism or international power imbalances. In the British school approach, they emphasize like overreaching forces, such as like the structure of the global economy or like influence of powerful nations and corporations on shaping the rules. So they're more like they'll often question like who is gaining from the system and who's being left out or exploited. So they argue that inequality persists because, for example, the global system is structured to favor certain groups, typically the wealthy natures, elites, and major corporations, often at the expense of others. So it recognizes that imbalances of power. That's my take.
Excellent. Thank you, Francis. All right. So question number 1, I mean, others reflections on the nature of differences that you could find that are attached with the two schools of thought, the American and the British IP. Yes, anyone else? Mm-mm. Mm.
Steph has her hand raised.
Steph, please go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Hi, yeah, sorry. I actually
Can I answer the second question, or is that?
Oh yeah. All
Okay.
right. All right. Okay.
Just because I took a few notes. I think from an ontological perspective, the American side, the way the text laid it out really shortly, like the driving ambition is problem solving versus the British school of thought. The driving ambition is amelioration, to make the world a better place, which is like an openly normative kind of purpose, versus Americans kind of strive towards the text said objectivity in the name of conventional social science. I thought was like a good simple way of conveying the differences. And then for epistemology, the American side works through, you know, formal research methodologies to test hypotheses, and the British side kind of is more. This is what was kind of less clear to me, because apparently they're not so rigorous in their methodologies, and they incorporate like a much broader, I think, range of research methods, and it's more critical. So maybe like participatory theory, and like I wanted to ask you what some examples of research
The
methodology.
American approach tends to take a more objective, scientific, empirical sort of hypothesis testing method. I mean, this is true of also the political science departments, right? If you were to get training in the political science department, the amount of quantifiable skill sets that you need to develop across the program is a lot more bearing than what you would do in a British political science or political economy department. In the British context, the idea is definitely a lot to develop perspectives that are argumentative in nature, where there's a lot of reading on different perspectives that's given. I mean, I would probably be more guilty of approaching this course, for example, in the more sort of British perspective than sort of taking the American side of things here. If I was to sort of pedagogically talk about it, because the nature of readings you would find would be more text heavy, more descriptive in nature, and that's something which the epistemological roots of British IP or school of thought takes. I mean, the objective in that regard, from a methodological standpoint, is to embrace intersubjectivities of thought and perspective, and also look a lot at context dependent situations, while in the American context you would look for more axiomatic causal interdependence of deterministic criterias, and those are more sort of scientific in nature. So you'll come up with correlative causal analysis of variables you're trying to test, and both have their own sort of value, right? I mean, basic economics also tries to assess and causate questions and study those through the same manner. Another field which I feel has sort of suffered the same flight to a certain extent is psychology. I mean, for anyone who's doing psychology, the expectation now to do psychometrics or tools which would train you in quantifiable techniques has over the time increased. And that's basically a larger North American influence on methods. So it's not, I mean, the idea here is to not engage, which the author I think cautions us also, is to engage in either ontological or epistemological relativisms to value one against the other, but is to really understand the nature of lens that the British or the American perspectives take. Steph, does that help in responding to the larger question? Yeah. Okay.
It does, and I think ideally, like the text mentions it too, it's like we should strive for a bit of both, right? Like the American school can learn from the multidisciplinary approach of the British, and the British school can learn from like applying maybe a bit more rigorous methodology in their work. I don't think it should be necessarily one pitted
One
against the
versus
other.
the other. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. So, like, I'll give you a reference point, right? The next topic that we're looking at is in terms of understanding market relationships. I mean, you have to look at variables of price and quantity and how those change in response to market forces. But there is more competition. The immediate example of studying the effect or the role of competition is what it does to price of a product. You go out with buying milk, and if you know that there is a sort of an oligopoly or a cartel of restricted number of sellers of dairy in the Canadian sort of dairy market, the prices would always be at a certain level. While if you open that market up and there are more sellers, immediately you'll see an effect of that on price. Now, that's a very empirically tested, scientifically drawn out, reality or realization. And you need that to be able to make sense of how market focuses work. At the same time, if we are looking at the topic we were looking at just a while ago, which is on conceptualizations of state categories based on historical formations, the logic of that would require you to look at different perspectives, not just one particular text, the role of colonialism, the role of institutional formation, state society relationship, all of those. So, yeah, you need to strike a balance. More importantly, I think both perspectives offer a lot of nuance in context to what you generally prefer. It also is about the kind of disciplinary skill set you have developed. Since international political economy is a very interdisciplinary field, a lot of people like to approach it from the training that they've had either in economics or political theory. Some have, let's say, maybe a background in philosophy or journalism and would be sort of looking at it from pockets of what they like studying in the field. Now, I want to sort of expand this line of questioning from question 1 and 2. I mean, you have a sense of both of those questions responded to in the text, and sort of expand the horizon a little bit in looking at question number 3. I want to know what your thoughts are here on what other schools of thought can be sort of reasoned in respect to understanding the international political economy landscape. I mean, you could see this from a very contemporary, current standpoint as well. So that would be helpful. You don't have to necessarily conceptualize a framework, but there are ways in which you can understand what other alternative schools of thought can find meaning. Mm-hmm. Anyone? Question number 3, any reflections? Peter? Yeah.
A bit outside of political science, but I was reminded of the distinction between like analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, where one is a more sort of trying to be a more precise scientific rigorous study, but at the same time kind of restricts itself to more smaller scope questions, whereas the other one is a bit methodologically more loose, but at the same time tackles bigger questions and isn't afraid to take on normative questions either.
So what other perspectives can fit in that regard? I mean, analytically or just in terms of the normative lens? I mean, one aspect is what you're saying, which is accurate in how you can study international political economy in a wider spectrum and canvas and see this. But in terms of gathering more perspectives which are originating outside what you see in the American and the British schools of thought, anything else that comes to mind? In fact, we were alluding to this sort of implicitly while talking about different state formations a while back, because we were talking about very different countries, contexts. But any perspectives that one can think about? Geographically, regionally? Yeah.
I'm going to be honest, I did a Google search here, so just to see.
Yeah,
But
please.
when it came up with like, Marxist, neo-Marxist, feminist, post-colonial, constructivist, developmentalist, green IEP in terms of alternatives. So like Marx's focuses on class, capitalism, global exploitation. Feminism obviously focuses on gender, on paid labor, patriarchal structures, post-colonial, non-colonial legacies, race and decolonization, constructivist ideas, norms, beliefs and belief systems. Developmentalist, that one is Global South, policy autonomy, which is one that we often discuss in development. You know, where it focuses on unequal integration of developing countries into the global economy, just to sort of take it further.
Yeah, so the three I think strike out, which are more what you would find have been schools of thought that have originated in the last sort of decade and a half. I mean, the feminist international political economy approach, the post-colonial, while it was embedded in existing schools, but branching out as its own school of thought under a wave of studies looking at decolonization more broadly, and green IP, right? You mentioned
Yeah,
towards the end,
yeah.
the sort of space which is really growing. I was recently at LSE, which has just started this Global School of Sustainability, and we were part of a few sort of meetings discussing what. So one of the larger vision now, which is advocating for the sort of transitions in growth literature, is to sort of looking at green growth, right? Focus on renewables, focus on infrastructure for which is sort of environmentally more sustainable and resilient to the nature of changes that climate change is imposing. But it's a big space which now requires, in a disciplinary sense, an overarching and holistic structure, both normatively and objectively speaking. And it right now doesn't have its own field. So it's a big, I mean, these are areas for anyone to look at, to work, so as to speak. I mean, the Marxist, neo-colonist, and even in fact, to a certain extent, the American and British classical IP sources are the foundation of a lot of the reading, the basic foundational reading in both political theory and economic thought. But things have really advanced, and one of the big regional perspectives that's now missing in the IP discourse, which I feel is extremely important. And I think somewhere the book that the China model by Daniel Bell does a good job, is to provide a Sino or an Asian or Chinese perspective to international political economy, which is extremely different, completely different from what you see or what you would have read today. In fact, the first chapter or the second chapter of Daniel Bell's book, which you would have when we start looking at China, engages with how the Chinese political system thinks very differently on normative questions. And the bearing of Confucianism is extremely strong, which is a dominant state or CPP philosophy. It's less with it, which is popular amongst the people, but more popular amongst the state, and has a very different response to the way you look at both the ontological and epistemological foundations. So a lot to, I mean, look at beyond the existing schools of thought. I mean, these are the more classical ways in which you could look at how many questions are responded to. From a methodological standpoint, I think settling between the objective, subjective, and mixed methods approaches, all three are very well sort of absorbed, and there is technologically now a lot of space to look at other ways in which you could use tools of GIS, geographical information systems, etc., to understand interesting issues. So I can give you an example where, if you're trying to study migration, right, as a field, which is a big, I mean, international migration is a big area to study, which is within now IP, a critical area. How would you really understand migratory flows of people within or across countries or regions unless you have good data to study? And what GIS does is, to the study of maps, it can give you a perspective on historically how the movement of people have happened, or even in fact what's happened to flora and fauna in terms of environmental change how forest degradation has happened in many emerging market economies, including India, Brazil. I mean, you've seen an extensive deforestation set of drives for urban infrastructure to be developed, and that has had its own effect. So the technological tools have also given, I think, new methodological contours, and those aspects are important to study. I understand completely that since a lot of you are coming from different disciplinary backgrounds, IPE looks like at a completely different scale or landscape, but it's not really, a very different field. It's embedded within basic foundations of what you do in both either political theory or economic thought. But it has meaning now in the way you understand the world around you. I mean, in international relations, there are perspectives that are dominant because of the change in power structures, that is the American or the British school of thought. But China plays a huge and important role in the way it perceives the world and asserts its own position. So it's important to look at its own state philosophy and political system structure. And those points was need emphasis as well. So with that, let me, yeah, we're at 11 now. So I'm going to sort of take a pause. It's a long morning. We've covered a lot of ground today. But I had to do that because we're not meeting, I guess, on the 1st. So there's a lot that we may need to cover then on the 3rd. So I wanted to not put too much of content in terms of teaching on just one day. So I have a couple of very quick things to go through, everyone, and this will be helpful for you to approach your upcoming assignment. There are details of documents that I've already shared. Let me just quickly go through. So if you were to look at the assignment document which were mentioned, so I think there are 3 documents, right, which I had shared with all of you over email that you would have received. One is the chapter in NTEM submission document, yes. And the other is yeah, the other is the virtual group presentation exercise. So that's the one which is due sooner than later. So I know there might be certain questions you might have, and I mean, we can discuss those. Let me first see if you're able to see my screen. Yeah. Yeah. So if you look at the virtual sort of group presentation exercise, what it tries to do is ask you to pick a particular country and look into the context of any 3 of its themes of concentration that you want to pick out of 5. And what would help you to sort of understand the context of these terms, right? Colonial history, institutions, integration, is when you look at this chapter by Danny Roderick, which will help you also sort of do a pre-read to a text we discuss in class. So as you look into this chapter, that is the introductory chapter, it talks about the role of creating growth narratives based on closer understanding of their colonial history, the role of political leadership and sort of institutions, integration, geography. So there are any 3 aspects that you need to identify from these themes in context to a country and then work towards a presentation task. There are 2 requirements. One is a recording, which is the recording of your presentation. But the other document is just more like a strategic brief of how you approach the assignment, what kind of sources you looked at, what and how your team members worked, I mean, in terms of work allocation. So this is something as a skill set useful to have. I mean, when you would go into boardroom meetings or presentation, it's always good to have a small sort of document which just helps people understand what the presentation is about. It's more sort of a input on the research and the work that is put in as a team. So that document would accompany the recording. There is only one change, I think, in terms of team composition for Cambodia. I just mentioned Jonathan, who's mentioned along Amaka, has Carl Peer. Carl Peer is just a student who's just joined the course. So I've also mentioned Carl's name there. So with Botswana, I think Peter is here and Katie would be the other person. So, I mean, that's just on the number of people that are there in the class. So for one particular group, you may have lesser number, but it no means it affects your evaluation. In fact, the accommodation is made in the design itself. If you're a 2-member team, I would know that it's 2 people who've done the job within the team constitution. So I think otherwise all groups have more or less minimum of 3 people with every team. Yes, Patricia, Ikram, Asiya in worst. Parent, Pakiam, Shiana in the, yeah. Luis, Charlie, and Mara in the third. Yeah, so it's 3 members for almost all teams that are mentioned. Yeah, any questions on this particular exercise? I mean, the document was shared yesterday, but I thought if there's anything that you need to clarify. Yeah, I think in terms of instructions, guys, just make sure you've sort of gone through everything. Don't miss any detail and last minute panic often sets in when submissions are there. So just try to get things done well ahead of time. And you have access to the drive folder, right? Which is the drive folder link that you can click to edit and upload the file. So I'm just trying to avoid emails being populated with too many submissions at the same time. So you just upload the documents right there. That will be helpful. If you have issues, if you have any issue with doing that before the deadline, you can email me and make the submission. That's fine. But make sure that it is up on the drive, because I generally check the drive and I know the time by which the file is uploaded. Yeah. Yes, Francia.
I just have a question for the book chapter and the book review.
I'll just come to that. Can you give me a minute? I'll just come to
Sure.
that, because let me first take any questions on this one. Presentation, guys, everything okay? All right, fine. The objective of asking you to look and pick a country or assign you a country so that you also develop a cross-country perspective in knowing more about a country, its own history. So there might be certain nations that you might have had very limited information knowledge on. So that's the whole point, is to read through as much as you can on one of those countries. I want to sort of now move to the chapter review and NTERM review part. Yes, Francie, please go ahead now. Your query.
Yeah, sorry. So I already have a book in mind that I want to do. So the way I understand it is that you pick a book and then you do one chapter review from that book, and then at the end you do the book review. Is that correct?
Yes, two chapters that you have to look from the book, from the table of contents, for the
Okay.
chapter review. And then for the NTERM book review, it's like the entire book.
Yeah. So do we let you know which book we're doing ahead of time via email? Is that how you know, or does it matter?
It doesn't really matter. It's just basically I would know when you submit the chapter review that that's the book.
Oh, okay. Okay, sounds
So
good.
but it's the same book that you have to stay with, which is a text that you've identified where you're doing the chapter review and then also the NTERM review. So for the chapter review and NTERM review, there's also a writing template document, which is a very suggestive list of things. This was a few years ago at Carleton when I was teaching version of the course that one of the TAs for the course had very sort of carefully designed for students at the time to understand basically how to approach a review. But what I generally suggest for those who are less acquainted to writing book reviews or just reviews in general is to read as many of published book reviews in texts that you can come across, and it'll give you at least an idea on how to approach your writing style. Just the one thing which you have to always avoid is that a review is not a summary, which is a lot of times what we end up doing is we read something and we summarize the text and we consider that as to be an extension of our assessment or our review of the text, and that one needs to consciously sort of avoid. As you read more book reviews, you'll see that there's a voice of your own understanding which is clear as you are reading and understanding the text and writing about it. And I think that voice needs to be very clearly present. Again, you have to avoid opinions and sort of stand alone your own dispositions. In an academic review, you would always use literary or citation based ways of justifying or reasoning with what you're writing. So some of those things are helpful, but I think as you read as many and more, if maybe perhaps in 3 days, if you read one book review, you're fine. And by the time you will start writing your own respective review, you'll have a good sense of the structure on what you want to do. Chapter reviews are a good sort of a preparation in terms of writing an end-term review. So that's due for your 16th of July. And then you have a 3rd of August deadline for the end of term book review. Both, again, Drive folders are shared in terms of where you need to put those things up. Title of book, student name, that needs to be there. So those are just basic details, but the titles, any thoughts on the reflections of what books have been mentioned as titles? So the easy way out, guys, is if you're not able to get a hard copy, is to try getting access to these texts if you can. I mean, it's an investment in terms of what you may want to buy or get, but that's the most I can suggest. There might be certain texts for which you can get e-copies through whatever means you might as well want to use. There's I don't know, proxies of what LibGen and other sort of stuff which can help you get access to e-copies, but that's your choice. The texts that are mentioned here have a dependence of a lot of topics situated in context to India and China. I think that's because of the larger scope of the course, but there are also other classic texts that are in there. I mean, just for those who are interested in looking something beyond these two countries. So it would be helpful for you to see and look at that accordingly. So the texts outside India and China, you'd see Raghuram Rajan's text on saving capitalism from capitalists, theory of moral sentiments, capital in the 21st century. So these are generally texts which within, or Republic of Beliefs for that matter. I mean, all these are outside any country focused discussion if you're looking for that. Okay, anything else? Any questions, queries, clarifications? Guys, this is usually a good time to do that as against doing it later, but I just want to know if the assignments by their very nature are clear and you're able to understand. Yes, Peter, hi. Yeah, please.
I had a question for the group presentation. I know it says that everybody should be visible at all times in the video during the presentation. Just wondering, is it okay for the presentation to be like virtual with just, people on camera side by side, or should people be in the same room ideally?
Yeah. I mean, till the time the one who's presenting is visible, that's fine. I mean, this is to avoid people, sending bytes of their own recording and just like things getting, we've been teaching for a while, so there are all kinds of experiments done by people to put an assignment together. So the idea is that there has to be an engagement with the team sort of doing this together. I mean, the way you do it is your discretion, but it's good to see and know who is doing what. On that note, it's also good to see and know when you're in class. So I'll just suggest that, guys, next class, just make sure for those who are not on camera, you're on camera, at least during the class hours when we're discussing. I want to keep this as interactive as possible. You will see me moving a little bit less towards sort of a singular monologue-ish discussion to asking each and every one of you, even those who are speaking less in class, to speak up more. That's as much as you would hate me for it, I'll do that. But I'll do it gradually. It's not the first very week. So yes, with that, I mean, that was much of the information I had to share. If there's anything else that comes to mind, please drop me a line, and happy to help. Have a great Canada Day. There is, I think, yeah, first we're not meeting. There is a text that we had, I've already mentioned this in class, but I'll just suggest you to look at least before your next class, is a text called Market Failure and Government Failure, which I would definitely suggest you to go through before you're coming in for the class. It will be, that's the title of the reading. At least make sure you've done and looked at this one before you come in for the class, even though other texts are all mentioned, but make sure at least this one is done, and it will help you with the class topic. Thank you, guys. Take care and be safe. Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Professor.